Imagine this. You're standing on a cliff in the Ethiopian highlands, wind whipping through your hair, the air thin and crisp at 12,000 feet. Below you, an ancient monastery clings to the rock face like it was grown there, not built. Inside those walls, monks in white robes are chanting in a language older than Latin, older than the Rome that once ruled half the world. They're reading from manuscripts that predate the Bible you grew up with. Manuscripts that contain books your pastor never mentioned, books that were once declared dangerous, heretical, lost forever. And on the illuminated pages in front of them, you see him, Jesus. But he doesn't look like the pale, blue-eyed figure from the paintings in your childhood church. His skin is dark, his hair thick and coiled, his eyes deep brown, unmistakably African. You blink, because for a moment the ground feels unsteady beneath you. What if everything you thought you knew about Christianity, about the Bible, about Jesus himself, was only one version of the story? What if another version, older, unbroken, never colonized, never reformed, survived right here all along? My friend, you're not just looking at a monastery, you're looking at a crack in history, a place where time refused to forget. Let me take you back to the beginning, before Europe ever decided what Christianity was allowed to be. The year is 328 CE. Rome is still pagan at its core, though a young emperor named Constantine has just started tilting the empire toward the cross. Across the Red Sea, in a kingdom called Axum, something extraordinary is happening. A teenage king named Ezana sits on a throne carved from black basalt. Two Syrian brothers, Frumentius and Aedesius, shipwrecked survivors turned royal tutors, have been whispering to him about a man from Nazareth who rose from the dead. Ezana listens. He listens hard. And one day he stands before his people and declares that the God of the Christians will now be the God of Axum. Coins that once carried the crescent moon and sun disk of older gods now carry the cross. Massive obelisks still under construction suddenly get Christian symbols carved into their bases. In a single generation, an entire African empire converts, not by the sword, but by royal decree. This is 30 years before Rome itself makes Christianity the state religion. Ethiopia doesn't receive the gospel from Europe. Ethiopia becomes Christian while Europe is still burning incense to Jupiter. Now look closer at those coins Ezana minted. On one side his portrait, on the other a cross with the Greek inscription, "May this please the people." But here's what most history books forget to tell you. Those same coins were also minted in Ge'ez, the ancient Semitic language of the kingdom, a language so close to the Aramaic Jesus spoke that scholars today use Ge'ez dictionaries to solve puzzles in the Dead Sea Scrolls. While Latin and Greek were busy becoming the languages of imperial Christianity, Ge'ez was quietly preserving something older, something that never had to be translated twice. Fast forward 300 years. The year is 614 CE. Persian armies have just sacked Jerusalem. The true cross has been carried off as war booty. In Rome, the empire is crumbling. Plague, invasion, darkness descending. But in the highlands of Ethiopia, monasteries are rising. Scribes copy the Gospels by candlelight on goatskin parchment. They copy more than the 4 Gospels you know. They copy the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, the Ascension of Isaiah, texts that Rome is already starting to call dangerous. While Europe loses entire libraries to fire and flood, Ethiopian monks build hidden churches inside caves and on mountaintops where no invading army will ever reach. And they paint. Oh, do they paint? In the Garima Gospels, hidden for centuries in a monastery so remote it can only be reached by rope ladder, you can still see the face of the evangelist Matthew, his dark skin glowing against gold leaf, painted sometime between 530 and 1660, making these the oldest illustrated Christian manuscripts on earth. Let that sink in. When Europe was still figuring out how to make books with pictures, Ethiopian nuns and monks were already producing masterpieces that would make Byzantine artists weep with envy. You've probably never heard of the Garima Gospels because for 1500 years almost nobody outside Ethiopia had. The monks kept them secret on purpose. They knew what happened when powerful empires discovered beautiful things. They get stolen, they get burned, they get forbidden. So the manuscripts stayed hidden, passed from abbot to abbot, generation after generation, while the rest of the Christian world argued, split, reformed, and forgot. Let me tell you about one of those forgotten books, the one that shocked Europe when it finally resurfaced, the Book of Enoch. You might have heard it mentioned in conspiracy videos, but here's what actually happened. In 1773, a Scottish explorer named James Bruce returned from Ethiopia, carrying 3 complete copies of a book everyone thought had vanished 1,000 years earlier. When he showed it to scholars in London and Paris, they laughed at him. A complete First Enoch? In Africa? Impossible. It had to be a forgery, except it wasn't. Carbon dating centuries later proved the manuscripts were ancient. Linguistic analysis showed the Ge'ez text had been translated from Aramaic originals, older than any surviving Greek fragments. The same book quoted in the New Testament letter of Jude, the same book early church fathers like Tertullian called Scripture, the same book that describes fallen angels teaching humans metallurgy and cosmetics before the flood. This book never disappeared. It was just waiting in Ethiopia. Inside its pages you'll find stories that make Revelation look tame. Angels called Watchers descend to Mount Hermon, take human wives, and father giant children who devour humanity. Enoch himself is taken on a tour of heaven, shown the storehouses of the stars, the prisons of the fallen angels, the coming judgment of fire. This isn't fan fiction. This is the cosmology many early Jews and Christians believed explained where demons came from and why the world was so broken. When the Roman Church decided the Bible needed to be shorter, neater, more controllable, Enoch was one of the first books to go. But Ethiopia said no. They kept reading it every Saturday in church, the way their ancestors had for 13 centuries, and Enoch is only the beginning. The Ethiopian Bible has 81 books. 81. That's 15 more than the Catholic Bible, 22 more than the Protestant one. There's 1 Enoch, 2 Enoch, 3 Enoch. There's the Book of Jubilees that claims the real calendar is 364 days and that angels keep the true Sabbath in heaven. There's the Ethiopian Book of Maccabees that tells a completely different ending to the Hanukkah story. There's the Shepherd of Hermas, the Epistle of Barnabas, texts that early Christians debated, including for centuries. Rome decided. Ethiopia never got the memo, or more accurately, they got it and threw it away. Now I want you to picture something with me. Imagine you're a 4th century bishop in Constantinople. You've spent your life arguing about whether Jesus has 1 nature or 2. You've excommunicated half your colleagues. You're exhausted. And then a messenger arrives from the south saying there's an entire Christian kingdom across the Red Sea that doesn't care about any of your counsels. They have more books than you do. They circumcise their children on the 8th day like Jews. They keep Saturday holy. They paint Jesus black. What do you do with that? You call them heretics and pretend they don't exist. That's exactly what happened. In 451, the Council of Chalcedon drew a line in the sand. Rome and Constantinople said Jesus has 2 natures, human and divine, perfectly united but distinct. The churches of Egypt, Syria, Armenia, and Ethiopia said no, 1 incarnate nature of God the Word. The difference seems tiny today, 1 Greek word, but it split Christianity forever. Ethiopian word, Miaphysite versus Diophysite. After Chalcedon, contact between Ethiopia and the rest of the Christian world almost stopped. Trade continued, pilgrims still came, but theologically, silence. Ethiopia became a ghost at the feast of Christian history, present but never invited to speak. While Europe went through the Dark Ages, the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, Ethiopia kept doing what it had always done. Monks copied manuscripts by hand. Priests danced before the Ark in their churches. Every village had its own replica of the Ark of the Covenant, because the real one, according to their sacred text, the Kebra Nagast, was hidden in Aksum, brought there by Menelik, the son of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Yes, you heard that right. While Europe was debating whether the Pope or the Bible had final authority, Ethiopian emperors were claiming direct descent from King David, saying their queen had visited Solomon, conceived a child, and that child stole the Ark of the Covenant on his way home. The Kebra Nagast, the glory of the kings, written down in the 14th century but based on much older traditions, became Ethiopia's national epic. It explained why they were special, why they never needed Rome, why their Christianity was the original, uncorrupted version, and for centuries, almost nobody in Europe believed a word of it. Until archaeologists started digging at Aksum and found something that made them choke on their assumptions. Massive granite obelisks taller than Trajan's column, palaces with 50-room stone foundations. Gold coins minted with crosses in 3 languages, inscriptions from King Azana describing his conversion. A cathedral built in the 4th century that may be the oldest Christian church in sub-Saharan Africa. Suddenly, the Kebra Nagast didn't sound quite so legendary anymore. Let me paint a picture for you. The year is 1200 CE. Muslim armies control Jerusalem. The Crusades have failed. European pilgrims can no longer visit the Holy Land safely, but in Ethiopia, a king named Lalibela has a vision. God tells him to build a new Jerusalem in the mountains. So he does, not with bricks and mortar, but by carving downward into solid red volcanic rock. 11 complete churches, all interconnected by tunnels and trenches. One church, Bet Georgis, is carved in the shape of a perfect cross, 30 feet deep, so precise that engineers today still argue about how it was done with Bronze Age tools. You walk down stone steps into what feels like the inside of a mountain, and suddenly you're standing in a cathedral with windows, columns, and reliefs, all part of one single piece of rock. This is Lalibela. UNESCO calls it the 8th wonder of the world. Ethiopians just call it home. Every year on January 7th, tens of thousands of white-robed pilgrims flood the site for Timkat, the celebration of Epiphany. Priests carry the tablets, replicas of the Ark, on their heads under golden umbrellas. Drums, thunder, trumpets made from horn-blast ancient melodies. People leap into pools, carved from rock to be baptized again, because this is their Jordan. And overhead, circling like they've done for centuries, are the vultures waiting for the scraps of sacrificed oxen, because nothing here has changed in 800 years. Now I want you to meet someone. His name is Abba Garima. According to tradition, he arrived in Ethiopia in 494 CE, sent by the 9 saints, monastic missionaries from the Roman Empire fleeing persecution after Chalcedon. Legend says he was so holy that God stopped the sun in the sky so he could finish copying the Gospels in a single day. Impossible, of course, except when radiocarbon dating was finally done on his manuscripts in 2006, scientists discovered they really were created between 330 and 650 CE. The Garima Gospels, the oldest illustrated Christian books in existence, and every single image of Jesus inside them shows him with dark skin, African features, thick hair. This wasn't a political statement. It was just what Jesus looked like to people who lived 2,000 miles closer to Judea than Rome ever did. You see, Ethiopian artists never had to imagine what a first-century Jew looked like. They saw them every day. The Beta Israel, the Ethiopian Jews, had been living in the kingdom for centuries, perhaps since the time of Solomon, perhaps since the exile. They spoke a form of ancient Hebrew. They kept strict kosher laws. They observed Saturday Sabbath long before Christianity arrived. When the gospel came, it didn't replace their Judaism, it fulfilled it. That's why Ethiopian Christians still circumcise on the 8th day. That's why they still avoid pork and shellfish. That's why their churches have a Holy of Holies separated by a curtain, just like the temple in Jerusalem. This isn't syncretism. This is continuity. Meanwhile, in Europe, something very different was happening. As Christianity spread north into Germanic and Celtic lands, artists started painting Jesus to look like the people around them. Fair skin, light hair, blue eyes. By the Renaissance, he looked like Leonardo da Vinci's cousin, and when European powers colonized the world, they took those images with them. In Mexico, Jesus became mestizo. In the Philippines, he became Asian. In Africa, he became white. And the oldest Christian nation on the continent, the one that had been painting him black for 1,500 years, was ignored, because acknowledging Ethiopian Christianity would have meant admitting something uncomfortable, that maybe the version of the faith carried by colonizers wasn't the purest, that maybe the Bible with fewer books was the edited version, that maybe the people who looked least like the Renaissance Jesus were the ones who looked most like him historically. In 1896, something happened that sent shockwaves through Europe. An Italian army, armed with modern rifles and artillery, invaded Ethiopia expecting an easy victory. At a place called Adwa, Emperor Menelik II met them with 60,000 warriors, some armed with spears, others with rifles bought with church gold. In a single day, the Italians lost 7,000 men. Ethiopia became the only African nation to defeat a European power in the age of colonialism. Newspapers in London and Paris screamed in disbelief. How could savages beat a civilized army? The answer was simple. They weren't savages. They were the descendants of Aksum, the people who built 70-foot obelisks when Europe was living in mud huts. But victory came at a cost. Ethiopia's independence made it more isolated than ever. Missionaries from Europe arrived, looked at the ancient churches, the dancing priests, the 81-book Bible, and declared it all corrupted. They built their own churches. They distributed 66-book Bibles. They taught that the Ethiopian tradition was primitive, Judaized, in need of reform. Some Ethiopians converted. Most did not. The old faith endured. Then came Mussolini. In 1935, Italian tanks rolled across the border again, this time with airplanes and poison gas. For 5 years, Ethiopia suffered occupation. Churches were bombed, priests were executed, manuscripts were looted. But the monks did what their ancestors had always done. They hid the books, they buried them in caves, they carried them into the mountains on their backs. When the British finally liberated Ethiopia in 1941, the manuscripts began to resurface, damaged but alive, and still the world ignored them. In seminaries across America and Europe, church history classes taught that Christianity came to Africa through 19th-century missionaries. Ethiopia was mentioned, if at all, as an interesting footnote. The Garima Gospels gathered dust. The Kebra Nagast was dismissed as legend. The 81-book canon was called apocryphal excess, but something has changed in the last 20 years. Ethiopian scholars, trained in their own monasteries and now earning PhDs in Europe and America, have begun speaking up. Manuscripts are being digitized. Radiocarbon dating has confirmed what the monks always knew. The Garima Gospels really are that old. The Book of Enoch really is that authentic. The churches of Lalibela really were carved with medieval tools, and slowly, painfully, the rest of the Christian world is being forced to listen. So here we are, you and me, 2,000 years after a carpenter from Nazareth changed everything, and I have to ask you something. When you picture Jesus, who do you see? The white Renaissance Christ that hangs in a million churches? Or the dark-skinned man painted by 6th-century African monks who lived closer to his world than any European ever did? When you open your Bible, Do you ever wonder what got left out? Do you ever ask who decided what was scripture and what wasn't? And why the oldest Christian nation on earth ended up with a different answer? Because here's the thing they don't teach in Sunday school. The Bible wasn't handed down on golden tablets. It was argued over, voted on, edited and fought for by men with politics and power and prejudice. And in one corner of the world, one stubborn mountain-walled kingdom said, "We'll keep what we were given." They paid for it with isolation. They paid for it with invasion. They paid for it with centuries of being called heretics and primitives. But they never stopped copying those manuscripts. They never stopped dancing before their arks. They never stopped painting Jesus the way their eyes told them he must have looked. And now the manuscripts are speaking. The stones of Axum are speaking. The rock-hewn churches are speaking. And they're saying something that should make every Christian on earth sit up and listen. The version of the faith you inherited might not be the only one that survived. It might not even be the oldest. My friend, the story isn't over. The monks are still chanting in Ge'ez. The priests are still guarding their tabots. The manuscripts are still waiting in cliffside monasteries for anyone brave enough to climb up and read them. And somewhere right now, a young Ethiopian girl is looking at an ancient painting of a dark-skinned Christ and seeing herself in the face of God. Maybe it's time we all did the same. Maybe it's time we listened to the tradition that never needed a reformation because it never forgot what it was given. Maybe, just maybe, the purest stream of Christianity didn't flow through Rome or Geneva or Canterbury. Maybe it flowed south, across the Red Sea, into the mountains of East Africa, where it has been running clear and cold for 1,700 years. And maybe the question isn't why Ethiopia preserved a different Christianity. The question is why the rest of us ever let ours change.